Hi, this is Dr. Sandy Queen with Queen Homeschool Supplies, and today I'm going to take you on a virtual tour of our latest book in the Discovering Nature and Science series, The Homesteading Life. This is a course for about 4th through 12th grade, mainly because we cover things like butchering the chickens that you raised that maybe you don't want to use with younger kids, but you know your kids better than we do, so we would recommend that you would use this course accordingly. So I'm going to take you on a very quick flip through here. And you will see that this book is laid out much like the other books in this series. We have an introduction here, and then we start getting into the lessons. And each lesson is 1 week's worth of material. In all the other books in our Discovering Nature and Science series, there's a story that continues through the year. And each week they would start on Monday with a chapter of that ongoing story. And the only difference with this particular course is that we don't have a story that they're reading. They're going to have information that they're reading. So we were able to keep that portion a little bit shorter in case you want to use the Homesteading Life along with another of our more traditional science courses in the Discovering Nature and Science series, like Further Investigation, which is chemistry, or Mary's Meadow, which is botany, which are more required sciences, because the Homesteading Life, we realize, isn't for everyone, although many homeschoolers are interested in aspects of homesteading, so definitely worth checking this out. Okay, so lesson one, with that said, lesson being a full week's worth of material, lesson one is covering what is a homestead, and we're looking at, that's day one, okay? Lesson two, lesson one still, which this is the next day, what is your homestead like? Okay, locally available building materials, the pros and cons of locally available building materials in your area, what skills are needed to use those building materials. Lesson 2, week 2, we're going to talk about on-grid and off-grid homesteads. My family lives in an on-grid homestead. My son and his wife in Alaska live in an off-grid homestead. I grew up in a house that was partially off-grid. We had solar heat, but we used on-grid materials, utilities for our others. So there are different types of homesteads, and some will be a combination. Many of them are a combination. So we're going to learn about all of those different aspects, the pros and cons of being on grid, the pros and cons of being off grid, living with less, living without. You know, do I really need all that stuff? Okay, the following week we're going to talk about water and how you can obtain water for human use, animal use, garden use. The pros and cons of each of those types of water, wells and springs, city water, water catchment systems, okay, dealing with wastewater and sewage. And now we're looking at the different forms of power. So looking at solar power here, I share a story of growing up in a solar home, how solar power works, where it works best, the cost to acquire, the pros and cons. And now we're looking the next week at wind power and looking at those same sorts of things, having the child find out about this stuff, okay? And now we're looking at hydropower the following week, and the pros and cons of that. Now looking at different ways to get heating and cooling on the homestead, looking at your comfort zone as far as heating and cooling, okay? How to use your generated electricity for power, for heat and cooling, wood and coal for heat, cooling your home on a homestead. And now lesson 8, we're going to start looking at growing food, starting with perennial vegetables, learning about your gardening zones, hardiness zones, and they're going to be researching different perennial vegetables that grow in their hardiness zone and finding out all about them. And now we're looking the following week at berries for our hardiness zone and what the requirements are, how you can use them, how many years you'd have to wait for harvest, all of that. Okay, now next week, fruit trees, same sort of thing. Which ones are good in your hardiness zone? Which varieties do you want to mature, dwarf or semi-dwarf? How many years will you wait until you get a harvest? What can you use that fruit for? Then next week, we're looking at vining fruits like grapes and kiwis, okay? So looking at those. Now we're looking at nut trees, same sorts of things here. And now the following week, we're going to start about with different types of gardening, starting with acreage gardening, which is just a traditional garden that you would see like on a farm where you're planting directly into the ground in rows. So they will research what's required, what crops are best suited, the pros and cons, is it for you? And they'll research this with all sorts of different types of gardening. Here we're looking at raised bed gardening and the same sorts of things that they'll find out about those. Okay, now we're going to look the following week at hugelkultur beds. And hugelkultur is a type of raised bed gardening, which they will learn about. And they'll learn the details and how to create those, and if they're the pros and cons, and finding out if they're best for you or not. Straw bale gardening, same sorts of things to learn. Hydroponics, different types of hydroponic gardening systems. Aquaponics, which are different than hydroponics. Vertical gardening, so which would you choose? Learning all about the different types of gardening and which is best suited for your homestead. Now we're looking at nourishing our soil, and we're learning about the types of soil, how to test your soil, the characteristics of different types of soil, how to nourish your soil for the right environment that you want, using manure and compost and all sorts of different things, companion planting, soil amendments, when to add them, which ones to add, why to add them, permaculture, where to locate your garden on your homestead and why you would choose certain places over others. And now we're learning about, this week, dealing with garden pests, particularly here, large animals, like maybe deer coming and eating your garden, okay? The next day we're dealing with small animal pests, maybe like rabbits or raccoons that like to get into our gardens. Insect pests, how to deal with those with companion planting, how to deal with those naturally without using pesticides. And now the following week, we're looking at how to extend the growing season with cold frames, with greenhouses, the different types of greenhouses, and what's the why would you want each one, which one's best suited toward you, organic versus conventional gardening. Now looking at animals to raise or not to raise, and that's an individual homesteader's choice. Now, some things that you'll want to look at is, do you have space, and how much space is required on the homestead for different types of animals, and what other requirements do those animals have? The downsides of having animals, the benefits of having animals. So they're going to research all of this. Now we're going to spend some time learning about poultry and the different types of poultry, different types of chickens we're starting with, learning about laying, meat, or dual purpose chickens, guinea hens, turkey, peacocks, peafowl, ducks, and they're learning all about these different animals, geese, why they would want to have them, why they're not a good choice for your homestead, what are you looking for to get out of these animals in your homestead, how to hatch your next flock, butchering your animals, butchering your poultry, how to cut them, raising meat rabbits. So now we're looking at the different types of animals that you can raise for meat on your homestead, the pros and cons of each of them, how to butcher them, how to use them, how to preserve them, looking into medium-sized livestock here, like goats, been there, done that, dairy goats, meat goats, sheep, llamas, alpacas, pigs on your homestead. And now we're looking at different breeds of pigs, the care of pigs, the pros and cons of pigs, the requirements for pigs, how to butcher a pig, raising cattle. And now it's going to talk about things like the space required to raise cattle. Do you want dairy cattle, or would you prefer beef cattle, or some of both? The pros and cons, how to butcher your cattle, how to use the milk from your dairy cows, dealing with predators. These would be predators specifically going after your animals, okay, not your garden. Might be some of the same predators in the case of raccoons. Some things you can do to help with that would be alarm birds like geese, larger alarm animals like donkeys, working dogs on the homestead, beekeeping, dealing with predators, other methods, okay, and these would be things like fencing and barriers, deterrence, yes, trapping, and we do talk about the safety of trapping and catching and releasing and that sort of thing there, okay, and what's legal. Hunting and fishing, again, talking about the legal end and why you might want to do this to procure food for your homestead. Preserving your bounty. So now we're going to talk about the different ways of food preservation. They're going to learn about freezing and freezing different types of food and why you would want to do that and what are the foods that are best suited toward that. Okay, pros and cons. You have to have freezers. Okay, preserving your bounty through canning. I do a lot of canning. Okay, and we're talking about canning. I do a lot of freezing too. Talking about water bath canning and pressure canning and steam canning. The pros and cons nutritionally and other ways of canning. The cost of the jars and the space that it takes. That kind of stuff. Preserving your bounty through dehydrating. Which foods dehydrate well, how to do it, the pros and cons, using your dehydrated food, other methods of food preservation here. Okay, also looking at freeze drying, smoking meats, preserving your bounty in other ways. The best choices for your homestead, and here we're going to look at your individual homestead and what resources you have and how that plays into what some of the choices are best suited toward your homestead. Okay, a root cellar, the ideal environment for a root cellar, pros and cons of a root cellar, where to locate your root cellar, organizing your root cellar, sharing your bounty for profit. And here we're looking at things like running a small hobby farm or bake sales or local produce sharing for profit, selling canned goods for profit. And we are looking at things like the legalities of that as well. Sharing your bounty as a blessing. Many hands make light work. And this is looking at things like some projects on the homestead that one person can do alone, versus some projects that you're going to need help with, and then some projects that may require expert help because things like electricity that you don't feel comfortable doing on your own that really should be done by an expert. Using things that you already have on your homestead. And then the last chapter is talking about designing your ideal homestead. Okay, the amenities of your land and researching those out. Animals, whether you have space to have all the ones you want, whether you can mix them together in the same area or whether you shouldn't do that. Okay, placement of animals on your homestead, placement of the garden on your homestead. And then in the very back, we have a list of the table, not really a table of contents, but the different chapter headings of things that are the main chapters covered in this particular book. So that is our newest book, The Homesteading Life, in the Discovering Nature and Science series. You can find this under the science section under the Discovering Nature and Science series at queenhomeschool.com.